everybody is very nice. Stuart's got the watch on that, thank you very much. I don't have one of those. I realise this is slightly odd because Stewart usually manages quite well all on his own. It's kind of his job really, isn't it? To sort of come out and stand there looking at us and doing things on his own, and now suddenly I'm here. And he usually does it standing up, as it were. And we're doing it sitting down. So the whole thing is quite an adventure. So I'm busy trying to work out why I'm here at the moment. But this may become apparent, or maybe not actually, now I think about it. So the idea this evening is I will ask Stuart some questions based on his book, which you've all read, but you're even so are going to buy 8 more copies of. To remind you of the title, it's called How I Escaped My Certain Fate, The Life and Deaths of a Stand-Up Comedian. And I assume that's Stuart. So I'm going to ask some questions, and then the houselight's going to come up, and you can fire some questions at Stuart yourselves. And this part of the evening will last for about an hour, and the signings afterwards will last for about 2 hours. So here we go. One of the first things I'll do in order to prove that I'm useful is to prove that I've actually read the book. And in order to do that, you'll see I've done that university thing of making notes. Do you see that? No, you can't see that, but never mind. So I've read some of these to Stuart, and he does agree that he did write these. So in fact, he said it's rather strange to hear these things said back to me. So anyway, so there's a little moment of strangeness going to happen now. Here we are. Here's a quote I wanted to throw at Stuart. I'm a stereotype of the kind of middle-class arts graduate that would live in a beatnik enclave of northeast London. And I've chosen the character I portray to the public. You'll notice there is precious little personal information in this book. This very paragraph, going into extremely dull and lengthy detail about a not especially interesting comedy trope, is itself a diversionary tactic. I am no one, full stop. No one. I haven't quite understood the full stop no one, as if somehow I am no one is not sufficient. That it needs another no one to explain why he's no one. But can I just put that to you, Stuart? You're no one, or perhaps you are someone because you did write what came before it. Where are we with that?
Well, what I think I was trying to say there is that it seemed to me that for comedians now and for people generally in whatever field they work in, if they're performers or writers, you're supposed to sort of sell yourself as a personality, and you have to do interviews like this, and you have to have a Twitter account, or you have to do a blog, or you have to go on chat shows and talk about yourself. And part of the sort of marketing push for anything is about who you are as a person. What are you really like? And I think for the stand-up I was doing, I think it gets in the way, because I like to be able to make things up that aren't true and pretend that they are true. And I also like to say things where you're not sure if they're what I actually think, or whether I am trying to be provocative or stupid or surreal or whatever. And I think knowing who someone is really works against all that in the live performance. So that's sort of what that's about. And I think you kind of notice it with Harry Hill, for example. Partly why he's allowed to be that character, I think, on TV to millions of people, is because he never really does any press about his family or who he is really, so people could accept that he actually is just a man with high collars in massive glasses who's, obsessed with making people in costumes fight. And though it's a kind of when I was asked about when I became an E-list celebrity a few years ago, there's a sort of expectation that you'll do a book, and you'll notice there's all sorts of unnecessary books written by E-list celebrities. And I knew that if I did a book about stand-up, I didn't want to talk about my life in any other detail other than what was relevant to the actual work, for those reasons.
And talking of writing books, I see in today's Independent it says that a major best-selling area is comedians writing their books about their lives and so on. But your book was not it.
No, it wasn't. No. But again, I sort of felt. I saw that today, and I laughed that I thought that Faber have got the new edition coming out of this book in August, and probably went, why aren't we on that? But I guess somebody at the Independent just thought it's not really relevant, and I can see why, because it isn't that kind of book. The books they're talking about there are good fun stories about some stuff happening in someone's life, and this is an annoying book with all sorts of complicated footnotes that I hope is sort of irritating and engaging in the same way as my act. And I don't really mind not being bracketed with all those other books, to be honest.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that most of those other books are written by what you call observational comedians, and you described observational comedy where what happens is that a comedian pretends to be like us, but in actual fact they're philandering cokeheads. I thought that was quite interesting, and it actually had never occurred to me, because I did believe that these people, when they say, I was talking to the missus yesterday, and her mum, hers, my mum, I thought that was true, but it isn't. No?
Well, I overstated the case there.
Oh.
The comic effect. But I do think there's a kind of thing in stand-up where a person goes out and their idea is that they say a thing and everyone in the room goes, oh yeah, that's like something that happened to me, or I relate to that. Or they nudge the person next to them, be it their best friend or their spouse, and go, that's what you're like. And I like seeing people when I was growing up in the 80s, like Jerry Sadowitz or Ted Chippington or Arnold Brown, all sorts of people doing quite odd things, or I'd watch it and I'd go, that's not like anything I would have thought, or it's not like the opinion of anyone I know. And so there's a part of me that wants to hang on to that, where the stuff you say isn't stuff the audience relates to. It's kind of maybe the opposite, and perhaps by saying the opposite you make them think about what it is that they do think.
Yeah, you do say things that are quite surprising. I'm thinking the one where you talk about Al-Qaeda and the IRA. I like that one a lot, where you say, Al-Qaeda, they're really bad, but the IRA, well, I mean, they were ours, so they were kind of all right, that one. And you're going, does he really think that? Well, I'm not sure I was, but anyway, there was one moment where you thought, does he really think the IRA are nice? Because, well, I mean, at least they were Catholic.
Well, what I was sort of thinking of, as I performed it, I kind of imagined that I'm leaning over my shoulder in a cab, talking to someone behind me, or like John Gordon, the radio thing, and where I got so confused by my dislike of Al-Qaeda on sort of racist grounds that I start preferring white terrorists, I
think they do, though.
Yeah, I think they probably do. Yeah, but again, that's a good example of if people knew what you wouldn't be able quite so easily to slip into that sort of, where just a little shift of tone of voice means that people kind of go, oh, he's sort of in character now. But if you were a hard and fast stage presence that had an obvious relationship with who you're supposed to be in real life, I don't think you'd quite be able to do that in the same way.
Now, you talked about something I was really, really interested in, that may surprise you, in the book, where you were really talking about the fact that even though you stand up, you hold a microphone, you're dressed in perhaps even these clothes, maybe they were used yesterday, I don't know, mine certainly were, and that even though there is this notion that a stand-up comedian is a real person, but in actual fact the performance is, you described two things. One, the idea that the performance is in inverted commas, and you quoted someone on that, but also that you went to France and you saw effectively they were clowns, who in their act would draw a circle and step inside the circle. Everything that went on inside the circle we understand to be unreal or not, or a comedy.
Well, they did that at a very specific point. The French, as you know, probably they're very hot on protecting their old traditions and culture. They won't, you have to play a certain amount of French language music, and they won't have too many American films on and stuff like that. And they spend a lot of money on local arts that is to do with traditions going back in the community. And one of the things that I saw in Languedoc was a thing where they send troops of people around in the summer to recreate this old tradition, which was a bouffonnades, which was basically a day where all the people that would be the outcasts in the town, people with handicapped people, or people that have been not allowed to do particular kinds of jobs, or people that were considered a burden, would be given free rein to make fun of the citizenry. And so they did this by, it was recreated with basically actors thing, where they go around different parts of the village, and outside the butchers they do a little skit making fun of saying the meat was bad or whatever. And the bit where they drew a circle in the ground was outside the church. They got to the church, and it really made you realise what a big deal it would have been in medieval France to do something against the church, when they all started dressing up as bishops and whatever. Before they did the bit, they drew this circle in the dust and talked, from what I could understand in French, with a little soliloquy about how this was allowed to happen. It was in a kind of protected space. It also made me think, I'm not an occultist or something, but it made me think of people doing rituals within a magic space as well, that you would kind of delineate out on the floor. And it was also something that was important to me at the time, because it was a lot of things were getting in trouble. Stuff that Billy Connolly had said, I remember, about hostages and things that we'd said apparently in the Jerry Springer the Opera that I co-wrote the words for. And a lot of the things that were being attributed to me, you said this, were things that characters had said in Jerry Springer the Opera. Like, you said God is a fascist tyrant. I went, well, I didn't say that. The devil said that. Jerry Springer the Opera. It's not an unreasonable point of view to think that he would have it. So I felt it was worth stating that things that happen on stage or in a story have been presented by the performers for a particular reason, and that they should be given that space to perform in. And because I was a bit mad, I think, in the wake of all the stuff about Jerry Springer the Opera.
Well, there was only 65,000 people who objected, was it?
Yeah, yeah. Still the most. Don't let Russell Brand let you think it was him. It wasn't. But I did used to come out and do for no reason at all before I'd started the show, that explaining it. I used to sometimes draw the circle in chalk on the stage, which then made me feel that I could go a bit further and have more fun in that 2005 stand-up show, which was specifically about religious censorship. So I thought, I'm in this circle now, and it's made of chalk, they'll never get me.
In fact, I was thinking about that, watching the Top Gear monologue. I don't know whether people have watched that, where apparently Stewart Lee, I don't know whether it was you or not, but Stewart Lee was saying that he'd quite like to see Richard Hammond dead and various other people dead and dying and blind and so on. I was quite interested in that, because at the very end you kind of went over to the camera on the YouTube clip that I saw and kind of explained to the Daily Mail that in actual fact what you'd just been doing was a form of comedy, just in case the Daily Mail bloke hadn't quite realised. Yeah. I was quite curious about that.
No, what I said to the camera, in case you don't understand, if you're watching this and you're from the Daily Mail or a local newspaper, what I've been doing there is I've been using the rhetoric and the implied values of Top Gear to satirise the rhetoric and the implied values of Top Gear. And so don't pretend that you haven't understood. That's what I said. The reason that I did that...
That's quite difficult though, isn't it?
Yeah. The reason I did that was for two reasons. First of all, I was running a show in Edinburgh in August of that year, 2009 I think it was, or 10. Anyway, and one night as I was going in, a bloke doorstepped me outside the Stand, which is a little comedy club in Edinburgh, and said, hello, I'm from the Mail on Sunday. I understand you're calling on stage for the death of Richard Hammond. And I said, have you seen the show? And he said, no. And I went, well, what it is, it's a joke, like in Top Gear, you know, when they do their jokes. That was kind of the idea of the show. All this is in the next book I'm doing, which is out in January. It's called If You Prefer a Milder Comedian. But the idea was that I wanted to say the sort of things they say about other people, but about them, and see how it felt. And then at the end of that night's performance, because I knew the bloke was in from the Mail on Sunday, I said on stage, if you are that bloke from the Mail on Sunday who was at the door, you've just seen how this works, right? And everyone in this room understands it. And I'm obviously don't mean what I've just said, so don't go back and write it up pretending that you haven't understood. But he did go back and do exactly that. What happened was, it was actually surreally funny. There was a page in the paper where it had a picture of me really smiling like that, and then underneath a picture of Richard Hammond's car exploding saying comedian Lee, vile funny man, has caused it says he hopes Richard Hammond died. Then there was a transcript of the act, which was sort of, obviously he copied it down in sort of shorthand, and it was sort of nearly right, but some of the choice of language was really not what I would say, and it was sort of really exaggerated, and but that made me laugh. Then because all newspapers now have a thing where the public are invited to comment, the Daily Mail comments just went nuts, and every 5 or so comments someone would say, I have seen this show and it is not remotely as described. And then the comments would just carry on. Someone on the Daily Mail website put, I think Stewart Lee should be banned from calling himself a so-called comedian. Those kind of people are so used to calling comedians so-called comedians that you can't even write a sentence without saying so-called. But my other reason for saying it was a practical one, which was when in 2005 or 2004, and when Jerry Springer the Opera was supposed to be touring, it kind of couldn't, because there was a lot of people wrote about things that were supposedly in it that weren't. I do understand why people were offended by it, but I more understand why people were offended by what was supposedly in it, most of which wasn't. And the reality of that, in practical terms, meant that we never really got paid for it in the way we should have done. But it's because it couldn't be put on anywhere, therefore you couldn't get any money from it. And my immediate worry when the Daily Mail man was outside was that this would go out of control like that. And I'd written a show and I wasn't going to be able to tour it, and it was very different to 4 years ago, where I now had a family and a little boy. And so really I wanted to put that bit in because I thought it was funny, but also it was like a damage limitation thing, where I thought if you actually say in the show what your intent is really clearly, having then done the bit, then journalists can't just pretend that they haven't seen it, but they did. So, but luckily it wasn't closed down or stopped.
Mm. Would it help to, I don't know, I mean, Tommy Cooper, he put on a funny hat, didn't he? And that said that though his real name was Tommy Cooper, but when he had the funny hat on, he was Tommy Cooper. Yeah. And that, in actual fact, secretly, he might have been quite a good magician.
Yeah. Well, I expect he must have been a good musician. Yeah, I'm a magician.
I mean, you never thought a hat?
No. Well, I think that works really well for some people, like comedians that are doing very specific characters that are allowed to have a particular kind of point of view. But I'd sort of like to shift sometimes within the same show, in and out of things that where I'm kind of talking in the voice of myself as a kind of teenage absolutist, when I was very dogmatic about things, and sometimes more as someone who's become a bit jaded or cynical.
And you also described as sometimes you do a smug wanker version of you.
Yeah.
You said, I only do me and the smug wanker version.
Yeah. Well, I'm aware of that. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I sort of think of something. I have a response to a news story or a particular event, and I think my instant reaction to it is a particular kind of view, and then I stop and I think, God, that is so conceited or arrogant or judgmental. But it is funny. I have to kind of step back into it. And actually, this is an example, I suppose, of how comedy is collaborative, but not always in the way that you realise, even though you think you might be writing for yourself. In as much as in 1989, when I first came to London, I shared a flat with Richard Herring, and we did a double act in the mid-90s. And I was doing stand-up, all the time then, and I would. But I would say things about things that I'd seen on the news or stuff I'd read in the paper, and he'd go, do you actually think that? And I go, yeah. And he'd go, if you say that on stage, people will laugh at it. And without wishing to sound like I've been to the Lecoq clown school, he did sort of help me to discover what my clown was, which was someone who would have these very dogmatic, judgmental sort of reactions to things, in some way sort of from the moral high ground. And I had to kind of realise that actually that was quite funny, to try and separate myself out from it, to be aware of it enough to play it for laughs. At the same time as sort of actually really being that kind of appalling person as well. And my wife's been very good since at pointing out all the things that are annoying about me, which I am able to then do on stage.
Yeah. I was quite intrigued also, you mentioned your wife there, assuming you have got a wife.
Yes.
Maybe you haven't. Anyway, this wife person, you were talking about Jesus in one of your sketches. I think you were sick on Jesus, in Jesus, over Jesus, through Jesus. And she pointed out that you had got Jesus slightly wrong,
Yeah.
which is quite possible because you're not a believer, so you were not only sick on Jesus, but you didn't actually believe in him.
Yeah.
It's quite complicated, isn't it, actually?
Yeah.
Anyway, no, I'm trying to work it out. But anyway, and she pointed out that, quite helpfully I thought, that actually Jesus would forgive you.
Yeah.
Well, because she is a believer, and I thought that's quite...
Well, it's an interesting, very odd situation we're in, where my wife's a proper goes to church Catholic, and I'm an atheist, but it's quite... After the initial struggle, it's quite interesting. And that piece, the first time I did it, it was a half-hour piece where I was trying to sort of do something about the idea that an image or an idea is offensive in of itself, right? And I wanted to try and do the worst possible thing I could think of involving Jesus, but make it into something that had a sort of meaning and was quite nice, at the same time as being superficially appalling. And the original sort of half-hour parcel, it was sort of like a struggle, like a fight, almost like an assault between me and Jesus, where I kept being sick on him in all different ways. And my wife-to-be then hated it. But
she didn't think of stopping it.
She didn't. Well, she
then.
hated it, but the fact she's also a stand-up comedian, Bridget Christie. The problem was the comedian part of her couldn't help but try and solve the problem of it. And she was saying the problem is, he should be forgiving you throughout, and trying to help you to be sick more, which of course made it truer and more funnier, and also kind of more worse as well. But yeah, so that was very interesting. It's sort of an example of having to kind of go against the grain. And what she's been very good at lately, actually, is pointing out that because I've had two well-received television shows, and that this book got a lot of good reviews as well, that even though I'm not like a stadium comedian, I do have a degree of status on some level that I didn't have certainly when we met, and that it means that if you're making fun of people, it can seem a bit more like bullying because it comes from a higher position, whereas before you're like a sort of rat fighting upwards at everything. And actually the fact that we were sort of prevented from working and sort of made quite broke by Jerry Springer the Opera was really useful, because it meant you were officially quite a low status figure, so you could push up at everything. Whereas now, often I'll say to her, what do you think of this? And she'll say, well, instead of making it sound like you hate it, make it sound like you don't understand it, or you're puzzled by it, or you think it's a good thing, and sort of overstate the case in the other way. So that's been really useful lately.
And do you take help and advice easily, or are you someone who says, yeah, but?
Well, increasingly I do, because I've been really lucky that the last few years I've worked with people who have different areas of skills to me that I can learn a lot from. I mean, with the last television series, Chris Morris was the script editor. Chris Morris who did Brightside stuff, but there wasn't really any scripts to edit because the budget was cut so much. It was just my stand-up, really. There weren't film stuff. It wasn't film stuff like there had been before. So people said to me, what did he actually do? And what he really did is he spent a week talking to me about how I was going to sort of lower my status in the programme to enable me to do a lot of the sorts of things I'd done before without looking so smug and arrogant. And I think he did that very well, really, in the end. But it was like a strange... There weren't really any lines came out of it, but it was more talking to people about ideas or pitch and tone. A lot of people, comics that have to do television, use writers now, which when I started was the difference between us and the 70s comics was that you didn't use writers, and that was like an old working men's club comic or variety turn kind of thing to do. But Frankie Brawl uses writers, and Michael McIntyre uses writers, all those guys use writers. I still don't use writers. I've got 2 lines by Simon Munnery in the last series, and 1 by my wife, and 2 by a bloke called Tim Richardson, who's a gardening journalist but has an interesting angle on the world. But what I do is I do talk to people quite a lot about sort of tonal things and trying to work out pitch and stuff like that.
My last question is something, but got to the end of the book, and I was very struck by a really nice contradiction, which is that if you're a stand-up comedian, you literally stand up on your own. It's a solo act, and there is this great big blackness around you. There is a spotlight, and there you are. You stand at the microphone on your own. And yet, by the time I got to the end of the book, I had met hundreds of people who you had either said what you liked about them, or why they pissed you off, or whatever. It didn't matter, but it was a kind of huge kaleidoscope of people. So on the one hand, you had this massive sort of collective set of performances, scripts, texts, and we had your texts, which sit there, the transcripts of your routines and so on. And I just love this idea that there's this solo thing, and then behind it, this kind of bloody great unseen army that you're drawing on. I found that really, really interesting.
Well, I'm aware that I've done quite well in the last couple of years, and I do think it's a lottery to an extent. And I don't understand if people have a sense of entitlement. They'll write a book saying, all these critics overlook me, and then in the end I do this. It's just like, I mean, there's a number of things that meant I've done better in the last few years, and they were, Ricky Gervais gave me a really good quote saying I was his favourite act in 2004 when he was really popular and people came because of that. I got better known off the back of Jerry Springer the Opera, and also having done stuff in the mid-90s with Richard Herring on Radio 1 and things like that to teenagers. I think that 20 years later a lot of those people grew up to be journalists or people that book theatres, and they came to work, And but I think that I was keen in that book to talk about all the people that I'd seen do stuff or been influenced by, or that I was aware that on some level, without actually realising it at the time, I'd sort of paraphrased or had a debt to, because most of them aren't very well known. And normally if you're a comic, normally when you meet people and you tell them you're a comedian, they go, "Who are your favourites?" I expect it's Peter Kay and so and so. And for most comedians, because we see thousands of comics, they tend to be, they're incredibly influential people that set a tone for things that no one really knows who they are, or they're known for something else. So I did want to put it all in a context in that book, and to try and make sure that I was fully accountable.
Your mum would rather you were Tom O'Connor, though, wouldn't she?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, she would have done. Yeah, but
didn't happen.
Yeah, it didn't happen. No, but
no.
I mean, Tom O'Connor's had a very good second wind, I think, as far as I understand it. He's doing a lot of really highly paid cruises and corporate work. There's a story in there, actually, I think it's in the book, about Johnny Vegas told me he first heard Tom O'Connor, the 70s comedian, when he found loads of discarded cassette tape albums of his stand-up performances in a bin bag on a piece of waste ground in St Helens, which was where burglars threw stuff they'd stolen and couldn't ship.
Have you told your mum that?
Well, she read that, so maybe it went in, I don't know.
Yeah. Your mum's very good at making quilts as well, which was great, actually. I like that. Yeah. Is anyone here good at making quilts? No, so it's quite a rare thing. So good. Okay, that was so I've opened it out. On that note, they're a bit disappointing that nobody can make quilts, isn't it? Really? Yes. Yeah. Lovely. Look. Oh, look. You're quite nice, really. What is somebody saying? Oh, you're all in rows, looking the same way. Yeah. Coincidence, isn't it? Right. But maybe if you could put your hands up, and we'll pretend we can see you. And then, right, there's a bloke here on the front row, so he's nearly front row. No. Oh, maybe if you have a microphone, that's a sort of democratic thing.
What's in the new book that's not in this one?
What's in the new book? What in the book out there? Nothing, an index. That's all. Yeah, good index though. But what? And also a really funny thing I found online where someone had written a parody of Tony Blair's memoirs in the style of this, right? Where they were all Tony Blair. There was a whole speech of Tony Blair about justification for the Iraq War, with footnotes like I've written himself, where he's saying things like, I found if I said weapons of mass destruction in a sinister way, it would help to swing the room. Then you put this would not work in Glasgow. I'm entirely sure who did it. It was really very funny. So it was only that. But the thing was, I was going to put the idea for the second edition was that it would also include the stand-up show I did after that, a transcript of that with notes on it, which was the show that Mike was talking about with the Top Gear stuff in it. But actually, there is a sort of narrative to that, and when it was done, they decided it was a sort of quite a standalone sort of thing. So we're doing that in February as a kind of book EP, which I'm happier about really. Yeah, so that's.
It's also mysteriously slightly smaller.
Well, it's slightly smaller.
Yeah, so this one's big, and this one's, the one out there is a bit smaller, so it should cost less. It does.
Yeah, it is.
There's Viv, the bookseller, pointing that out. Yeah. Okay, let's have another question.
Well, there's a man there.
Yeah, and there's another guy in sort of more or less the same place. In fact, they're sitting next to each other. So that's good. Yeah.
Hi, Stuart. Would you ever do another show like the Richard Not Judy show on TV?
Well, when people ask you, would you ever do another series or whatever, it's not up to you. You can't go to someone and go, can we do this again? You know, because they have the television people have to want to make it. I don't think I would, because it's a lot of that. This one with Not Judy was a lot of work for not. You didn't really get a lot out of it. Also, I don't think it would be commissioned now. I don't think anyone would get anything like that on daytime television.
Can you just say a little bit about the show and why?
Well, this one, Richard Not Judy, was the kind of thing we used to was with Richard Herring, and it was live on Sunday mornings, and we used to improvise some of it as we went along and write most of it in the week, and no one really noticed it, and then it stopped. But years later, lots of people picked up very fond memories of it. But also, you know, what I do now is I'd either before that double act I was doing stand up on my own. I was doing stuff all the way through it, and since, and I think I'm onto something with the stand up where it's not quite like what anyone else is doing. I'm not saying it's better. It is different. It probably worse. And I've also written for stage and things like that, and whereas the double act was a bit like a half measure, you know. And also Richard Herring I did the double act with, and I both found that that anything we used to do in the double act we can do quite well in stand up by doing a kind of second voice that is a sarcastic impression of the other person. And then you get to keep all the money.
And he's just a bit, actually an enormous amount more obscene than you.
Yeah, he is now.
Yeah.
He's carved out that. The other reason why the double act wouldn't work now is because there's two reasons. First of all, we met when we were teenagers, and it was about men bickering, and it's sort of easy to do that when you've got the memory of being a teenager. I think a lot of the best male double acts are like that. I've always said to me, it'd be really funny to do it again in our 60s or 70s. And there's a great film of a really famous Glaswegian music hall act called Frankie and Josie, who were huge in the 50s, and then didn't do anything for about 40 years, and then about 10 years ago got back together, and they were really old. And it's hilarious. They're like really, really old men doing childish arguments, and it's superb. So I'd quite like to do that. The other reason the double act wouldn't work is because in a good double act there's an identifiable weight difference between the people. And I've on weight, Rich has lost weight, I think, probably on balance over the 15 or so years since we last worked together. There's no real point in having those two people on a stage. Nothing I can do about it. This would work. This would work. Man, and the thatch man is alright.
Of course, that old man thing, that's George Burns and Walter Matthau, isn't it? In a movie that I've forgotten what it's called.
The Sunshine Boys.
The Sunshine Boys,
yes,
thank you. Right, let's have another question. Maybe from another place in the room even. Just to sort of be creative about it for a moment. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, yeah. If stand-up is art, what is it that makes it art? Or it can be art, what makes it art?
Well, Simon Munnery's got a really funny line about that. It's amazing, throughout the book and in conversation, when asked to answer any question or think about anything, it's amazing how often I just refer to something he's already said. It's a great one for sort of witty aphorisms. And he says, he saw a review of himself in a national newspaper that said that Simon Munnery is the closest stand-up comedy can come to art. And then he drew a Venn diagram on stage where there was stand-up comedy and art, and they were in different circles, and there was no way they could ever overlap. And he realised that he wanted to be art, but he would never be, because you can't. He said you could never be art. It could be the closest it could be to being art, which meant that really, really great stand-up comedy is still only shit art. But I think, again, partly in the book I talk about stand-up comedy being an art. Partly it's overstating the case with comic effect, and it's sort of the conceit of the joke of doing the whole thing, which is why I went to Faber with the idea, was that obviously Faber's a sort of, you know, it's a respectable highbrow publisher, and that they can't give you anything like the fee that Ebury Press and all those people that you see in supermarkets would give you, but they do come out and it's got Faber on the side of it. And to do a book with Faber where you treat stand-up comedy as if it were art and annotate it. I always had it in mind the level of footnotes and annotation that there is in they did an edition of The Wasteland that I read as a kid, where it's got each page has got a whole page of notes opposite it, so with all Ezra Pound's corrections and things like that. That's what I wanted it to be like initially. Seriously, was have a page of stand-up with all the stuff on the opposite page going into incredible detail. And that's what I did with Faber. The conceit, the sort of joke was, what if you did treat stand-up as if it were worth analysing in the same way as The Wasteland was, by Eliot, one of the great, but then the more I wrote the book, I realised that I was that good. And it sort of become a kind of end in itself, doing it. And the more I thought about it and realised how many things in stand-up I got thinking about jazz or certain bits of highbrow art, but also, you know, lowbrow art, the more I became convinced it was a good way of writing about it. What I sort of hoped it would do, and I think it has done this on some level, I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet though, would be to give critics a way of writing about stand-up, right? Because they they struggle a bit. 20 years ago when I was first going to the Fringe, 25 years ago, it wasn't even really thought it was worth getting a proper critic to write about stuff. They get like the cookery correspondent or something from the Scotsman, and they'd say go and do all the comedy, and they'd go and do it. And the reviews of stand-up were normally things like, the man came out, he picked on a man with a jumper on, it was funny, and then it finished, you know. And I was sort of aware that a lot of the people I liked in the 90s, no one really had the tools to write about it. So I sort of thought it'd be quite good to introduce ideas into writing about stand-up and to see what happens. Although what I've noticed with reviews of the telly show this time around, I sort of think it's almost like hearing that come back at you, like you put it out there and then it gets read and they go, oh, he's doing this. And that's what I wanted to sort of say, was that you might not like it, but I had chosen to do it that way, you know. So, but as for it being art, I think it is an art, and within that there's all sorts of gradations, and someone talking about politics and highbrow subjects is not necessarily more of an artist than someone talking about toilets and farts. They're all like about controlling the flow of information to people in a room.
But isn't part of the reason why stand-up, in a sense, isn't treated as an art is because art in the literary world has to be on paper. We've if you like, elevated the written word to a point where art must be written down. So if you have an ephemeral form, which apparently the stand-up comedian might do the same gags for 10 years, so it isn't that ephemeral. But it's the fact that it appears to be oral, it appears to be just like chatting. So therefore we say it can't be art, but a poem can be because it's written down in a book.
Yeah, well, even that person doing the same gags for 20 years, they have to make decisions on the night about the shape of a room.
Absolutely.
I mean, in a way, that's a problem with the book. Is I think that stand-up is about what happens in a room and the tone in that room and how the audience respond to things. And those transcripts are transcripts of particular nights, and there were always things that were different. And I kind of think ideally, stand-up shouldn't work written down. I think if it's really doing what it should be doing, it shouldn't work written down, because it should be about the tone of voice of the persona, of the performer, and what they're saying should be changed by the kind of face they're making and all sorts of things. So in a way, the fact that it can be written down and that it's been reasonably well received shows that it's deficient, what I've done. but I think that is part of the problem, is that it is can't really bottle it. And even you might go and be at a stand-up show and really like it, and then see the DVD that comes out of it the same night that you were at, and just not enjoy it because it was partly about the feeling in the room of what could happen and didn't.
Yeah, I can remember once going to see Dame Edna, and she asked someone on the front row about their toilet, and she was getting into quite an interesting conversation about this bloke's toilet, and then she said, "What colour is it painted?" And he said, "Brown." And then she just stood there in the middle of the stage and looked at the audience, and the place just sort of shook for about half an hour or so at the thought that this bloke's toilet was brown. But anyway, you had to be there. All right. Okay, let's have another question. But I think it's sort of what you mean, because if you did that, what colour is your toilet? Brown. You know, on the page. Anyway. Yeah, make point. Right. Okay. Somebody else? Yeah, go on. Yeah, you choose to. Yeah, we're sort of. That person there, is it? Yeah, yes, go on then. Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, on the art and comedy crossover kind of thing, have you ever noticed, and I have, I won't mention his name because that would be a bit rude, but quite well-established artists doing what I might consider to be quite shit comedy, but then lots of critics saying that's fantastic art because he's bringing comedy that doesn't normally get used in the art world into this other art form. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah.
And what do you think about it?
Well, a bit. I mean, I know that Banksy uses lots of Simon Munnery's lines that he sprays up, but he has paid him for that. But when a critic sees them sprayed up by Banksy, they seem profound, whereas when they're said by Simon Munnery, they seem like jokes. And so it's just context. One of them, particularly apposite one that Banksy's used, is many are prepared to suffer for their art. Few are prepared to learn how to draw. I also think that a lot of that Brit art, like the sensation generation, those conceptual art things are often like a one-liner. They're like a Jimmy Carr joke, where you look at the image and you go, "What's that?" And then the title is the joke, and that the actual piece of art that's been constructed is not necessarily beautiful or worthwhile in of itself until you get the punchline of the title, like Damien Hirst's shark in a tank, and then the punchline is it's sort of like the impossibility of the concept of death in the mind of someone living or something, and the two tied together, and you kind of go, "Oh yeah, great." But so I do think there is that, and I think I know Arthur Smith saying he'd taken a load of conceptual artists along to see a lot of stand-ups in Edinburgh, and then came out thinking, what could they use from it? Also, when you look at a lot of the variety terms, well, they're so close to things that now would count as performance art, you know, and yet they were playing out to working class audiences in places like the theatre next door on a Friday and Saturday night. There was
like Flanagan and Allen, or
well, more. There was a guy who was very popular in Scotland. He was called the Man Who Sings Danny Boy, and the old folk song. And he put in as many verses as possible of Danny Boy. Apparently there's a lot, and it could make it last about 12 minutes. An old lady was telling me she'd seen this, and that she went back again and again. She couldn't believe it. And what it was you didn't notice. He stood like this and sang Danny Boy, but over the course of a quarter of an hour, his arms became slowly longer until finally his hands were on the floor. And then he'd go off, you know. That's Turn of Bride stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking, it's an exhibition of surrealist art, must be from, or Dada, from right just before, just after the First World War, and there's some French windows, and they're blacked out, and they're called French widows, is that right? Yeah. It's Duchamp, isn't it?
Well,
thanks for helping. Yeah. No, it isn't. I don't know. Anyway, because then he called the urinal, he called it La Fontaine, didn't he?
La Fontaine, yeah. I mean, I do find a lot of that period of stuff's really funny, and I think, but I do think that the Dada people and that were much more honest about their relationship with vaudeville, I think, than conceptual artists are today. There's not a lot of crossover.
Is that what you meant? Is that what you were referring to? Or was it? Or kind of not?
Do you have a particular person in mind that you think's common?
Yeah, go on. You know, you can share. You're amongst friends and enemies, so it's fine. No. So, but were you meaning someone? So just so I could be clear, do you mean somebody who is an artist but who uses comedy, and then they go, "Wow, that's really art," because it's in his art?
I guess what I mean is, if they came to the same thing as a comedian,
you think, it's alright, it wasn't that funny.
Yeah.
But they do it in the context of being an artist.
Right.
And people think, wow, using comedy, that's so unusual.
Yeah.
Take on art.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's you have to get a specific example.
And then you get people like John Hegley, who are incredibly funny, and then they tell him that he's not a poet.
Yeah.
He's just a comedian. Or whatever, and so on. Yes, and nauseam. Okay, somebody else then. Lovely, who we got? Yes, there's this fella here, just got his hand up. And if you people up there, and if you're allowed to wave your hands, and people can throw your microphone as well. Sorry, go ahead, yeah.
In your TV show, you talk about how in the 80s comedy was really political, like you'd pay a couple of quid to spend a night hating the Tories and having a lot of fun. I wondered if you'd seen, like, now that the Tories are back, the strikes and protests to that, if you saw that element of the scene starting to come back or have a revival as well.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been on the circuit in clubs much in the last sort of 9 months or so, because I was doing all the gigs to work the telly out on my own. I think it's interesting that when whatever it's it's interesting that whatever its strengths and weaknesses were, when Channel 4 did was it called the 10 o'clock show? Yeah, this time around.
10 o'clock live.
Yeah, 10 o'clock live. Normally, comedy on that kind of comedy on Channel 4, the panel shows, whatever, has quite a reactionary tone. Weirdly, the 10 o'clock show had quite a liberal, left of centre tone, which presumably means somebody at Channel 4 thought kids might buy that at the moment. Otherwise they wouldn't be doing so. Presumably there must be a perception that there's a time for that. But I don't really know about the circuit. Also, partly why the stand-up was left of centre in the 80s was because it had come out of an earlier traditions of things like the People Show, or things like devised theatre, or street performance, or radical theatre like Tony Allen's and all that kind of stuff. And so that's where it was from. There wasn't anybody going into alternative comedy in the 80s thinking they might get to play Wembley Stadium or do an advert. There was no reason to believe it would lead to that. But I think obviously now it's a much broader church. There's all sorts of reasons why someone might get involved in it, and also the people that are getting involved in it now look at the last 20 years of it, and it isn't necessarily obviously connected in any way to its early relationship, alternative comedy, with left-wing theatre and left-wing cabaret and that sort of thing. So I don't know if it would come back in the same way, but I think that there's a niche market to work of disgruntled liberals, and if I can work that market, then I think there might be a sustainable future in that. For that reason, I'm delighted about the rise of the right across Europe.
It's an image of a thinner and thinner layer. Anyway, yeah. Right, okay, somebody, how about anybody up in the gallery? My boy up in the gallery. No, this bloke is not in the gallery. I don't think I've had a question from a woman yet, but it is allowed, I think. Probably, yeah. But that's the bloke. Yeah, keep going, that's right. Carry on, back, up, that's it, keep going. And, no, I'm not David Dimbleby, yeah, that's right. That's it, he's the one, yeah.
Hi. You speak about the aristocrats in your book, the film, and when you're writing, are you aware of who you're going to be or may not offend, and do you look for that when you're writing, or does it happen naturally when you're writing something who you're going to offend?
Well, I've talked about this before to someone that accused me of setting out to cause offence. I said I don't set out to cause offence. It's just sometimes it's a sort of accidental byproduct of what you're writing about. And the way I chose to explain that was when a dog does a shit on the pavement. It's not done that to offend you. It's just something it has to do. And you may be offended by it, but that wasn't the intention of the dog. It probably wasn't the best way of trying to explain it. But I've never set out to cause offence. And I think sometimes you can see in the writing of some stuff that people have a shocking idea and work back from it, thinking, what would be a way of getting into this, right, in a funny way. Well, I sometimes have an idea the end point might be shocking or cause offence, but it's not necessarily intended to. I think
You're also sometimes questioning why someone would be offended, which is slightly different. So you're actually raising that question in itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the film The Gentleman's Talk About the Aristocrats is different. I mean, they're sort of talking that about offence as an end in itself, and that it's, you know, quite a liberating and cathartic thing. I found that it was very interesting to watch that film. But even then, in that, the end point for them was someone trying to do something about 9/11 in New York days after it had happened. And the argument was that the audience took it in the spirit that it was meant. It was a very cathartic thing. So even in that film where Paul Provenza and Penn Jillette were trying to make out that offence was an end in itself, they ended up with an example where it wasn't, where it was about something else.
So we should say just a little bit about the film.
Well, The Aristocrats is a really interesting film. I think I can see why people wouldn't like it. I've seen it a few times, and sometimes I get really fed up with it. But there's a joke which we don't have in stand-up in Britain, but there's a joke that all American comics like telling each other, which is called, the joke's called The Aristocrats. The punchline of the joke is The Aristocrats, and it doesn't matter that you know that's the punchline. But it's a joke that clearly goes back years. It's like a vaudeville kind of joke, where a guy comes to a vaudeville agent to pitch his act to them, and the vaudeville agent says, "What's your act?" And the man describes his act, and it's him and his wife and their children. The description can go on for ages and ages and ages. It usually involves the family all having sex with each other and being covered in excrement, and dogs being killed, and it goes on and on and on, and bicycles being ridden over corpses and whatever. People can make it last half an hour, this description of this act. And then at the end, the agent goes, "That sounds appalling, I can't believe that would be your act. What's it called?" And the man says, "The Aristocrats." And the idea is that it's a terrible act which is given this sort of sophisticated highbrow name that a different kind of act would have. See, it doesn't really, it doesn't seem like much, but in this film they get literally dozens of comics to all tell it in different kinds of ways, and you get a real feel for what Provenza talks about, the singer, not the song. The idea that you can take the same material and different people can do it in different ways. George Carlin describes that act as if the people have sort of, with such a world-weary way, it sounds like they've been forced to do it against their will, and it seems to have a kind of tragedy about it that seems profound. Billy Connolly does it in such a way as it sounds like the people are having the time of their life. No, they're all sort of different. Then there's a great bit where he gets a mime artist to act it out, and it's really hilarious. But so that's the film. And I saw that film by accident at a comedy festival in America around the time that the people were complaining about Jerry Springer the Opera, and it was a bit that and seeing the French clowns was a bit of a lifeline to me. Actually, it made me sort of feel that the sort of things I was thinking about had been thought about before by better people who'd come out the other side of them. So it was very encouraging. But I do recommend The Aristocrats. I think it's really great.
Okay, I think we've got time maybe for one more question. Maybe one more. Yes, somebody down here on the front. Okay, a few lines along. Lovely, thank you very much.
Hi. Was it quite a cathartic experience writing the book, not just for the people who maybe weren't as helpful as they could have been along the road, but also getting a chance to say thank you to the people who did help you?
Oh yeah, I mean, writing the book was absolutely brilliant. I was so grateful to the opportunity, it made me, on a practical level, it made me think really carefully about all the things that I'd written in stand-up and how I'd done them. It made me realise what were cliches of what I did that I perhaps should stop doing, or things that if I kept repeating them enough, people might think they were signature moves. It also made me see how much things had changed between stuff, 20 years doing it, the context of the world that we did stand up in, and also what you could do, and that was really, really great. It was like drawing a line under the whole thing and being able to move forward from it. It was also great to be able to go through it and credit people for things, to put things on the record where you felt stuff had been said about you that wasn't true. Most people in their lives don't get that opportunity, and it was really nice to be able to thank people. And it was also nice to, I think, and Arthur Smith wrote a book that did a similar thing recently called I Am Daphne Fairfax. Well, he's from a generation kind of 5-10 years before me, but we both wrote a lot about what the 80s in alternative comedy meant to us, and then what's bizarre about that whole period is that now everything turns up on YouTube. You know, there's guys doing open spots in clubs for the first gig they've ever done, and it's filmed and it's on YouTube. There's kind of not really any footage of most of the people that we liked. There's more footage of Wilson, Kepler and Betty doing the sand dance in the variety theatres than there is, say, of Malcolm Hardy live, or of Simon doing the God and Jesus double act, or of Ted Chippington, or of Arnold Brown when he was starting. It's kind of not really there, so it was nice to sort of, in the opening part of the book, get it all down. But I kind of think it's a folk memory, and it's sort of going to go, and it's not really been written about. It was nice to. It made me realise that partly why I'm not in that list of writers, comedians doing books that's in the Independent, and why I'm not on Roadshow and BBC One or whatever, is because I kind of tried to locate myself as belonging to that tradition, even though I'm too young to have done so, really, rather than where we are now. And it was really nice to be able to sort of write about all those people and all the bits that I still do that are really to do with that.
And as you point out, you're not Stewart McConey either, which I thought was quite helpful when you pointed that out. I never thought you were Stewart McConey, but obviously your first names are similar, so but the resemblance seems to end there. The other lovely thing I think about this book is that actually there's a subtext, which is that you offer a kind of classification of comedy, or certainly classifications of stand-up. So there is a sort of subtext that is even more learned than the footnotes in a way, because you've actually ended up with a sort of sense of the genre and all the different parts of it. But there we are.
Oh, it's very kind of you.
No, it's lovely, lovely book. Absolutely pissed myself, and even was trying to read bits out to my good missus while she was trying to leave the room.
That's like, if you've seen on television people walk out of my gigs when I'm performing, and they try and leave the room when Michael's reading bits of the book out.
Bloody good. But anyway, I was weeping. She was for other reasons, but anyway.
Can we mention something?
Mention.
There's a show on here tonight, 8 o'clock, which is Eric's Tales of the Sea, and Eric is a former, submarine sailor, and has written this show about what that was like. And I've seen it twice in Edinburgh in a friend, and it's really good. And you could get a drink now and go to that, and I don't think you'll be remotely disappointed by it. So good.
Yeah, that's Eric's Tales of the Sea. There you go.
It's here in an hour.
In an hour.
That's really easy to remember.
Yeah. So you haven't got to go far, really. No. It's next door, though. It's not actually here.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it may get lost.
You have to get these things right. I just finished on this. Hotmail, I don't know whether you know, when you have Hotmail, they have little headlines next to your Hotmail thing, and it said today, Miley Cyrus spotted without boyfriend. Why would you want to know that? I just thought I'd leave you with that. Anyway, Stewart will be signing books. Thank you all very much for coming. Stewart Lee.